some ancient places don't feel right. Not because they're broken, but because they were built too well. Massive stones placed with precision. Burial chambers designed to last forever. Entire landscapes reshaped into structures we still don't fully understand. These aren't myths. They were found, studied, and still leave questions behind. In this video, we're exploring ancient structures and artifacts that feel far more advanced than their time. The deeper you go, the harder it is to explain them. If you enjoy content like this, make sure to subscribe before we begin and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Because some of these places don't just stay in history. The circular stone tower that defies its time. Broch of Gurnis. At first glance, it looks like a cluster of low stone ruins sitting quietly near the coastline, shaped by time and weather, with nothing immediately dramatic about it. Nothing that suggests complexity or advanced design, just walls, curves, and scattered structures that blend into the surrounding landscape. But the moment you begin to understand how it was built, that first impression starts to change. Because this is not just a simple settlement, it is a broch. And more specifically, the Broch of Gurnis, located in Orkney, a structure that represents one of the most sophisticated forms of dry stone construction from the Iron Age, built without mortar, relying entirely on the placement, balance, and weight of stone to create something that has survived for centuries. The central feature is the tower, circular in form, rising from a thick base, with walls that are not just solid but hollow in sections, creating internal spaces within the structure itself, a design that immediately sets it apart from simpler constructions, because it shows that this was not just about stacking stones to create height, but about creating a system within the walls. And that system matters, because inside the thickness of the wall, there are passages, small chambers, and stairways that wind upward, suggesting that the structure was designed to be used not only around it, but within it, creating layers of space that extend beyond what is visible from the outside. And that level of planning reflects understanding, not just of materials, but of structure, of how weight is distributed, of how stone behaves when placed in certain ways. Because building something like this without mortar means that every stone has to be positioned correctly, every angle has to contribute to stability, every layer has to support the next. And that precision is not accidental. It comes from experience, from repeated construction, from knowledge passed down and refined over time. Surrounding the central tower is a settlement. Multiple smaller structures arranged around it, forming a kind of community layout, with houses, pathways, and boundaries that suggest organized living rather than random placement. And that organization is important because it shows that this was not just a single building. It was part of a larger system, a space where people lived, moved, interacted, where daily life took place within a structured environment. And that environment was designed, not just built. Because the placement of the buildings, the way they relate to each other, the way space is divided and connected, all suggest planning rather than improvisation. But the purpose of the central tower itself is still debated, because while its structure is clear, its exact role is not fully agreed upon. Some interpretations suggest that it may have served as a defensive structure, a place of refuge or protection, given its thick walls and elevated design, which would have made it more secure than the surrounding buildings. And that idea makes sense, because the construction is strong, compact, difficult to breach. But there are also arguments that it was not purely defensive, because the surrounding settlement suggests a more stable environment, not one constantly under threat. And the internal features of the tower, including the complexity of its design, may indicate that it served additional roles, possibly as a place of status, a central point within the community, a structure that represented something beyond function. And that possibility introduces another layer, because structures like this often carry symbolic meaning as well as practical use, representing identity, authority, or presence within a region. And that meaning may have been just as important as any defensive capability. The location also plays a role, because being near the coast provides visibility, access, connection to movement, whether for travel, trade, or communication. And that positioning suggests that the site was not isolated. It was part of a broader network, connected to other places, other communities. And that connection influences how the structure is understood, because it shows that this was not a random choice of location, but a deliberate one, chosen for its advantages. Even now, when you stand within the remains of the Broch, the design is still visible. The curvature of the walls, the thickness of the structure, the sense of enclosure combined with verticality, all of which create an impression of something that was carefully thought out, not just constructed for immediate need. And that impression is important because it reflects intention, not just in building, but in design. Because creating something like this requires more than effort. It requires a plan, a concept, an understanding of how different elements come together to form a complete structure. And that understanding is what remains, even as parts of the structure have been lost, even as time has altered its appearance. The core design is still there, still visible, still showing how it was built. And that visibility allows us to interpret, to analyze, to reconstruct at least in part the thinking behind it. But the full meaning is not entirely preserved. Because while we can see how it was made, we cannot fully access why it was made in exactly this way, for exactly these purposes. And that gap is part of what makes it compelling, because it leaves space for questions, for interpretation, for continued interest. And maybe that is what defines the Broch of Gurnis. Not just its structure, not just its survival, but its ability to show us a level of complexity that challenges simple assumptions. A reminder that even in the Iron Age, people were building with intention, with knowledge, with a sense of design that goes beyond basic construction. And that realization is what stays. The royal tombs hidden beneath the earth. Alaka Huyuk. At first, it appears like a quiet archaeological site, a stretch of land marked by low stone remains and reconstructed gateways, nothing that immediately reveals the depth of what lies beneath it, nothing that clearly shows why this place became so important in understanding early civilizations in Anatolia. But the surface tells only part of the story, because beneath this ground there are tombs, not ordinary burials, but carefully constructed graves that contain objects, arrangements, and details that suggest something more than simple burial practices, something that reflects status, belief, and a level of organization that goes beyond what we might expect from such an early period. This is Alaka Huyuk, and it is known for its royal tombs, burials that date back thousands of years, associated with early Bronze Age societies long before the rise of large empires in the region, yet already showing signs of complexity, of structure, of meaning expressed through how the dead were treated. The tombs themselves are not monumental from the outside. They are not towering structures. They do not dominate the landscape in the way later constructions might. Instead, they are built below ground, with stone-lined chambers that hold the remains, creating a space that is hidden rather than displayed, protected rather than exposed. And that choice matters, because it reflects a different approach, not one focused on visibility, but on preservation, on creating a defined space that separates the burial from the surrounding earth. And within those chambers, the arrangement of objects becomes significant, because alongside the human remains, there are artifacts, metal objects, ceremonial items, and most notably, standards. Intricately designed objects made of metal, often featuring geometric patterns, animal forms, and complex shapes that suggest symbolism rather than simple decoration. And these standards are unlike typical tools. They do not appear to serve a direct practical function. They are too elaborate, too carefully shaped, which suggests that they were created for a purpose that goes beyond daily use, possibly ceremonial, possibly symbolic, possibly connected to belief systems that are not fully preserved in written form. And that is where interpretation begins, because the presence of these objects within the tombs suggests that they held importance, either to the individual buried there or to the community that placed them there, indicating that the act of burial was not just about placing a body in the ground, but about creating a context, a setting, a representation of something that extended beyond the physical remains. The materials used also matter, because metalworking at this stage required skill, knowledge of heat, of shaping, of combining materials in ways that produce durable forms, and that level of craftsmanship reflects a society that had already developed techniques that go beyond basic survival. And that development suggests organization, because producing such objects requires resources, time, and the ability to dedicate effort to something that is not immediately necessary for survival. And that ability reflects structure within the society, roles, specialization, the presence of individuals who focus on creating rather than simply gathering or producing food. And that level of organization is significant, because it shows that even at this early stage, communities were already complex in ways that are not always visible on the surface. The burial practices themselves also show patterns. The positioning of the bodies, the placement of objects, the repeated use of certain forms. All of these suggest that there was a system in place, a set of practices that were followed, possibly with variations, but still recognizable as part of a shared approach, and that shared approach reflects belief, not necessarily in a formalized system that we can fully reconstruct, but in a set of ideas about death, about what happens after, about what should be done when someone dies. And those ideas are expressed through action, through how the burial is performed, through what is included, through how the space is arranged, and that expression is what remains, because even without written records, the physical evidence shows patterns that indicate meaning, even if that meaning is not fully understood. There is also the question of status, because the presence of elaborate objects within certain tombs suggests that not all individuals were buried in the same way, that some received more attention, more resources, more complexity in their burial, which indicates a distinction within the society. And that distinction reflects hierarchy, the presence of individuals who held a different position, a different role, a different level of importance within the group. And that importance is carried into the burial, not just in the body, but in everything placed around it. And that connection between life and burial is important, because it shows that death was not treated as a complete separation, but as a continuation of identity in some form expressed through the objects and arrangements that accompany the individual. Even now, when the site is examined, the tombs provide insight not only into what was buried, but into how people thought, how they organized their world, how they expressed ideas that are not directly visible but are reflected in action. And that insight is valuable, because it fills gaps, not completely, but enough to show that this was not a simple society, not one defined only by basic survival, but one that had structure, meaning, and the ability to create objects that carried significance beyond their immediate use. And that complexity is what defines archaeological. Not just the tombs, not just the artifacts, but the combination, but of both, creating a picture of a society that was already thinking in ways that connect material, meaning, and identity. And that connection is what remains. The stone chamber built like a hidden dome, beehive tomb of Atreus. At first, the structure does not fully reveal itself, because from the outside it appears as part of the landscape, a mound of earth that blends into its surroundings, giving little indication that something complex lies beneath it, something carefully built and precisely engineered thousands of years ago. But as you approach the entrance, the scale begins to change your perception, because the doorway is not small, it is monumental, framed by massive stones, carefully placed, rising upward in a way that immediately suggests that this was not a simple burial, but something constructed with intention, with planning, and with an understanding of form that goes beyond basic building. This is the so-called treasury of Atreus, often referred to as a beehive tomb, located near Mycenae, and it represents one of the most advanced examples of thalos construction, a type of architecture that creates a domed interior space using stone, without relying on true arches in the way later structures would. And that distinction matters, because the dome is not built using a central support or a keystone arch. Instead, it is formed by placing each layer of stone slightly inward compared to the one below it, gradually closing the space as the structure rises, creating a core-belled dome that supports itself through balance and weight. And that technique requires precision, because each stone must be placed correctly, each layer must align, the distribution of weight must be understood. Otherwise, the structure would collapse. And the fact that it still stands shows that the builders understood exactly how to achieve that balance. The interior space is what defines the experience, because once inside, the scale becomes clear. The chamber rises high above, forming a near-perfect circular dome, smooth in appearance, with stones fitted together so closely that the surface feels continuous, despite being made from individual blocks. And that continuity creates a sense of unity, a space that feels complete, contained, not fragmented. And that effect is not accidental, because shaping a space like this requires more than just stacking materials. It requires a concept, an understanding of how the final form will look and function before it is fully built. The entrance passage, known as the dromos, also plays a role in shaping that experience. A long, straight approach lined with stone, guiding movement toward the entrance, creating a transition from open space into the enclosed chamber, gradually shifting the environment from exterior to interior. And that transition is important, because it controls how the space is encountered, it prepares the movement, it directs the path, and that suggests that the design was not only about structure, but also about experience, because the way a space is entered can be just as significant as the space itself. The purpose of the tomb is generally understood as funerary, a place where individuals of high status were buried, possibly members of a ruling class or elite group within Mycenaean society. And that interpretation is supported by the scale of the structure and the effort required to build it. Because constructing something of this size would have required resources, labor, coordination, and time, all of which suggest that it was not built for ordinary use. It was built for someone considered important. But even within that understanding, there are questions, because the interior of the tomb does not always contain the objects or remains one might expect, leading to the possibility that it was looted in later periods or that its use changed over time. And that absence creates a gap, because while we can see the structure, we cannot fully reconstruct everything that was once inside it. And that limits how much we can say about its exact use. But the structure itself provides enough information to understand that this was not a simple burial. It was a statement, not in words, but in stone. A demonstration of capability, of organization, of the ability to create something that goes beyond immediate necessity. Because a structure like this is not required for burial. It is chosen. And that choice reflects meaning, status, belief. The idea that the individual placed within this space was connected to something greater, something that justified the effort required to build such a structure. And that connection may have included ideas about the afterlife, about continuation, about how the dead were perceived in relation to the living. But without written records directly tied to the tomb, those ideas remain inferred, based on comparison, based on pattern, based on what is known from other sites. And that leaves a space for interpretation, for uncertainty, but not for doubt about the construction, because the physical structure is clear. It exists. It stands. It shows how it was made. And that clarity is what allows us to understand the level of skill involved, even if the full meaning is not preserved. Even now, standing inside the chamber, the sound changes. The light shifts. The scale becomes more apparent. And the space feels different from the outside world. Contained, defined, intentional. And that feeling is part of the design. Because creating a space like this is not only about structure, it is about how it is experienced, how it affects those who enter it. And that effect is still present, even after thousands of years, even after changes to the surrounding landscape, because the core of the structure remains, unchanged in its fundamental form. And that persistence is what makes it significant, because it shows that the design was not only effective, but lasting, and that longevity connects the past to the present in a direct way. Because what was built then is still visible now, still understandable, still capable of being experienced. And that connection is rare, because many structures from that time no longer exist in a form that can be fully observed. But this one does. And that makes it more than just a historical site. It becomes evidence of what was possible, of what was achieved, of how people, thousands of years ago, were already capable of creating spaces that combine engineering, design, and meaning in a way that still resonates today. And that realization is what remains: the faces hidden in stone. Marca Huasi stone formations. At first, the plateau looks like any other high-altitude landscape, a stretch of open ground scattered with large rock formations, shaped by time, wind, and changing temperatures, with nothing immediately suggesting that this place is different from other natural environments found at similar elevations. But that impression doesn't last, because the longer you stay, the more the shapes begin to change. Not physically, but perceptually. What once looked like random stone begins to resemble something familiar. Edges align in ways that suggest structure. Shadows create depth where none seemed obvious before, and gradually certain formations start to look less like rocks and more like something shaped. Faces, figures, forms that appear almost intentional, as if they were carved rather than formed naturally, even though their origins remain uncertain. This is Marca Huasi, a plateau in Peru known for its unusual stone formations, and what makes it stand out is not just the shapes themselves, but how those shapes are perceived, how they shift depending on light and angle and distance, creating an experience that is not fixed, but constantly changing. And that variability is important, because it makes interpretation difficult. At one angle, a formation may look clearly like a face, with defined features, eyes, nose, and mouth appearing in a way that feels structured and deliberate. At another angle, the same formation may lose that clarity, returning to something more abstract, something that no longer resembles anything specific. And that shift raises a fundamental question. Are these formations natural, or were they shaped by human hands? Because both possibilities exist. Natural erosion can create complex shapes, especially in environments where temperature changes cause expansion and contraction, where wind and water gradually wear down surfaces over long periods of time. And over thousands of years, those processes can produce forms that resemble familiar objects, including faces. But the level of detail in some of these formations goes beyond what is usually expected from random erosion, leading some to suggest that at least part of the shaping may have been intentional, that natural forms were recognized and then modified, refined to enhance the resemblance. And that idea introduces a different kind of interaction with the environment, not building something entirely new, but working with what already exists, identifying shapes within the stone and bringing them out more clearly. And that process would require observation, imagination, the ability to see beyond the surface, to recognize potential form within irregular shapes. And that ability is not simple. It requires perception, a way of looking at the environment that goes beyond immediate function. But even with that possibility, there is no clear evidence that confirms deliberate carvings across all formations. Some may be natural, some may be altered. And distinguishing between the two is not always possible with certainty. And that uncertainty is part of what defines Marca Huasi, because it exists at the boundary between natural and artificial, between what is formed and what is shaped, creating a space where interpretation plays a central role. But beyond the question of origin, there is the experience itself, because being in a place where shapes seem to emerge from stone, where familiar forms appear in unexpected ways, changes how the environment is perceived. It creates a sense of presence, of something that feels more than just physical. Because faces carry meaning. They are associated with identity, with awareness, with observation. And when a face appears in stone, even if only as an illusion, it changes the relationship between the observer and the object. It creates a sense that the environment is not just being looked at, but is in some way in it looking back. And that effect can be powerful because it engages perception in a way that is not purely rational. It operates on recognition, on instinct, on the tendency of the human mind to find patterns, especially those that resemble living forms. And that tendency is what allows these formations to exist in this way, because without it, they would remain just rock, just shape. But with it, they become something else, something that holds attention, something that invites interpretation. And that interpretation can vary between individuals, between cultures, between time periods, because what one person sees clearly, another may not see at all. And that subjectivity is part of the experience, because it means that the site does not present a single fixed meaning. It allows for multiple readings, multiple perspectives, and that openness is what keeps it engaging. Because it does not provide clear answers, it presents possibilities, and that is what remains. Not just the formations, but the way they are seen, the way they are interpreted, the way they create a connection between the observer and the environment. And maybe that is what makes Markwasi stand out. Not because it can be fully explained, but because it cannot be fully reduced to a single explanation, existing instead in a space where natural processes and human perception combine to create something that feels intentional, even when its origin remains uncertain. And that experience is what stays. The artificial mountain built for a king, Herodium. At first, it doesn't look entirely natural. And that is what makes it stand out even from a distance, because the hill rises in a way that feels too symmetrical, too controlled, as if its shape was guided rather than formed, creating a silhouette that appears deliberate against the surrounding landscape. This is Herodium. And unlike most ancient sites, this is not just a structure built on a mountain. It is a mountain that was shaped into a structure. Built under the direction of King Herod, a ruler known for large-scale construction, this site represents something unusual. Because instead of adapting to the landscape itself was altered to fit a vision. And that changes how the site is understood, because shaping a hill is not a simple extension of building. It requires moving massive amounts of earth, planning the final form, ensuring stability, and integrating architecture into that altered terrain in a way that holds together over time. And that level of transformation reflects control, not just over materials, but over environment. At the top of the hill, the remains of a palace complex still stand, arranged in a circular form that follows the shape of the summit, with walls, towers, and internal spaces that suggest both function and design, creating a structure that is not only elevated, but also enclosed, separated from the surrounding land. And that separation matters, because it creates distinction, a clear boundary between the space of the ruler and the space beyond it. And that boundary is not only physical, it is symbolic, because elevation itself carries meaning. It creates visibility, dominance, a sense of presence that can be seen from a distance. And that visibility was likely intentional, because placing a structure at such a height ensures that it becomes part of the landscape, something that defines the horizon rather than blending into it. But the site is not limited to the summit, because below there are additional structures, including lower palaces, water systems, and other architectural elements that extend outward, creating a complex that is larger than it first appears. And that expansion shows planning, because it connects different levels of the site into a single system, not isolated buildings, but a network of spaces that function together. The water system is particularly important, because maintaining water at a site like this requires engineering. The ability to collect, store, and distribute water in an environment where natural sources may not be immediately accessible. And that system reflects understanding of flow, of storage, of how to manage resources over time. And that management is part of what allows such a site to function, because without it, the structure would be limited in its use. But beyond the engineering, there is the question of purpose, because Herodium is often associated with Herod himself, not only as a palace, but also as a place connected to his burial, a location that combines residence with legacy, a space that reflects both life and death, and that combination is significant, because it shows that the site was not only functional during his lifetime, but also intended to remain important afterward, serving as a marker, a place that continues to represent him even after he is gone. And that intention is reflected in the scale, because shaping a mountain is not necessary for basic function. It is a choice, a statement, an act that goes beyond practicality. And that act suggests something about how power was expressed, not only through control of people, but through control of space, through the ability to reshape the environment itself. And that ability requires resources, labor, organization, because such a project cannot be completed by a small group or in a short time. It requires coordination, planning, execution over an period. And that level of effort reflects the structure of the society that made it possible, because it shows that there were systems in place to support such construction, to gather materials, to direct work, to maintain progress. And that organization is part of what defines a site. Even now, the shape of the hill remains visible, the symmetry still noticeable, the structure still present, even if parts of it have been lost or altered over time. And that persistence is important, because it shows that the transformation of the landscape was not temporary, it was lasting. And that longevity connects the past to the present in a direct way, because what was shaped then is still shaping the landscape now, still influencing how the space is seen, still defining the horizon. And that continuity reflects the success of the design, because it achieved what it set out to do. It created something that stands out, something that endures, something that represents more than just a building, but an idea. The idea that space itself can be controlled, shaped, redefined. And that idea is what remains, not just in the structure, but in the impression it creates. The sense that this was not simply built, but imposed on the landscape, with intention, with purpose, with a vision that extended beyond the immediate present. And that vision is what stays. The stepped mountain built to reach the sky, ziggurat of Ur. At first, it looks like a massive staircase rising out of the flat land, a structure so large and geometric that it immediately separates itself from the natural surroundings, its straight lines and layered form standing in contrast to the open landscape around it, creating a presence that feels intentional from every angle. This is the ziggurat of Ur. And unlike many ancient structures that were built to house people, this one was built for something else entirely. Something that was not meant to live within it in the usual sense, but to be approached, honored, and elevated above the ordinary world. The design is simple at a distance. A series of terraces stacked one above the other, each level smaller than the one below, forming a stepped pyramid that rises upward not smoothly, but in stages, each layer clearly defined, each platform distinct, creating a structure that is both stable and imposing. But that simplicity hides complexity, because constructing something like this requires more than stacking materials. It requires planning, understanding weight, understanding how to distribute that weight across layers so that the structure remains stable over time, especially in a region where the primary building material was mud brick, a material that can be strong when properly constructed, but also vulnerable to erosion if not maintained. And that is where the design becomes important, because the core of the ziggurat is made from sun-dried mud brick, forming the bulk of the structure, while the outer layers were often covered with fired bricks, providing a more durable surface that protects the interior from weathering. And that combination shows adaptation, the use of available materials in a way that maximizes their strengths while minimizing their weaknesses. And that reflects knowledge, not abstract, but practical, built through experience, through understanding how materials behave over time. But the structure is not only about construction, it is about elevation. Because the purpose of the ziggurat was not to serve as a residence or a defensive structure. It was a temple, or more precisely, a platform for a temple, a place where the sacred space was elevated above the ground, physically separated from the ordinary environment. And that separation is significant, because it creates a distinction between levels, between spaces, between what is accessible and what is not. The ascent itself becomes part of the experience, because reaching the top requires movement, effort, a progression upward that changes perspective with each step. And that movement is not random. It is directed, structured, guided by stairways that lead from one level to the next, creating a path that is both physical and symbolic. Because ascending a structure like this is not just about reaching a destination, it is about the act of rising, of moving from one level to another. And that movement can carry meaning, especially in a context where elevation is associated with closeness to something beyond the physical world. But even with that understanding, the exact rituals and practices associated with the ziggurat are not fully preserved in detail. Because while we know that it was connected to religious activity, the specifics of what took place there are not completely recorded in a way that allows full reconstruction. And that leaves space for interpretation, for inference, based on what is known from related texts and sites. But the structure itself provides enough information to understand that this was not an ordinary building. It was designed with purpose, with intention, with a clear idea of how space should be organized to reflect certain concepts. And that organization is what stands out, because the structure creates hierarchy, not just socially, but spatially. Lower levels, upper levels, each with a different access, different meaning. And that hierarchy reflects a way of thinking, a way of structuring the world, not as a flat space, but as layered, divided, ordered. And that order is expressed through architecture, through the way the structure is built, through how it is experienced, through how it is approached. Even now, standing at the base of the ziggurat, the scale is immediately clear. The width of the structure, the height of the terraces, the way it dominates the surrounding area, all of which contribute to a sense of presence that is difficult to ignore. And that presence is part of its function, because a structure like this is meant to be seen, to stand out, to define the space around it. And that visibility reinforces its importance, because it becomes a focal point, a place that draws attention, a place that represents something larger than itself. And that representation is what remains, even as parts of the structure have been lost or restored over time. The core design is still visible, still understandable, still showing how it was intended to function. And that clarity allows us to see beyond the material, to understand the idea behind it. Because the ziggurat is not just a structure, it is a concept, expressed in stone and brick. The idea of elevation, of separation, of creating a space that stands between different levels of existence. And that idea is what stays. The hill that became a fortress, made in castle. At first, it looks like a natural rise in the landscape, a broad hill with gentle slopes and open space. Nothing that immediately suggests complexity or design, just part of the terrain shaped over time by natural forces. But as you begin to move closer, the shape starts to change, because the slopes are not entirely natural. The lines are too controlled, the edges too defined. And slowly, what seemed like a simple hill begins to reveal itself as something else entirely, a structure. This is Maiden Castle, one of the largest hill forts in Britain, a site that transforms the landscape into something deliberate, something constructed not by building upward, but by reshaping what already exists. And that approach matters, because instead of creating a fortress from scratch, the builders used the hill itself as the foundation, modifying it, reinforcing it, turning it into a defensive system that integrates with the natural terrain rather than standing apart from it. And that integration is what defines the site, because the defenses are not simple walls placed around a flat area. They are layers, multiple ramparts and ditches that follow the contours of the hill, creating a complex series of barriers that extend outward, forming a system that is not easily approached or crossed. And that complexity is intentional, because each layer adds difficulty. Each ditch creates a gap. Each rampart creates an obstacle. And together they form a defense that is not just physical, but strategic, designed to slow movement, to control access, to make any approach more difficult and more predictable. The entrances themselves reflect this design. They are not direct. They do not allow a straight path into the interior. Instead, they are arranged in ways that force movement to change direction, to pass through controlled spaces, to navigate turns and narrow points that would have made entry slower and more exposed. And that design shows planning, because it anticipates movement. It considers how people would approach, how they would attempt to enter, and it shapes that movement in a way that benefits those inside. But the site is not only defensive, because within the enclosed area, there is space, large open areas that would have supported settlement, with evidence suggesting that people lived here, that this was not just a place of refuge, but a place of daily life. And that combination is important, because it shows that the site served multiple purposes: protection, residence, organization, all within a single space. And that requires coordination, because maintaining such a site involves more than building it. It involves managing it, living within it, using the space effectively. And that reflects a level of social structure, because organizing a settlement of this scale requires planning, roles, cooperation, the ability to coordinate activities within a defined area, and that organization is visible in the layout, in how space is used, in how movement is controlled, in how the environment is shaped to serve both defensive and daily functions. The scale of Maiden Castle is also significant, because it is not small. It covers a large area with multiple layers of defense extending outward, creating a footprint that dominates the surrounding landscape. And that dominance is not accidental, because placing such a structure on a hill increases visibility, allowing those within to see outward, to observe the surrounding land, while also making the site itself visible from a distance. And that visibility creates presence, a sense that the site is not hidden, but meant to be seen. And that presence may have carried meaning beyond defense, because large structures often serve as markers of identity, of control, of territory, signaling that a particular group occupies and defines that space. And that signaling is part of how landscapes are understood, not just physically, but socially. Even now, walking along the ramparts, the design is still clear, the layers still visible, the paths still defined, creating an experience that reflects the original intention, showing how movement was meant to occur, how space was meant to be navigated, and that clarity allows us to understand the structure not just as a set of remains, but as a system, a coordinated arrangement of elements that work together to create a specific outcome. But the exact details of how it was used over time are not fully preserved, because sites like this often change. They are modified, expanded, adjusted. And those changes can blur the original design, making it difficult to separate what was first built from what was added later. And that adds complexity to interpretation, because the structure we see now is the result of multiple phases, multiple decisions, layered over time. But even with that complexity, the core idea remains clear: the transformation of a natural hill into a fortified space, a place where environment and construction merge, where defense is built into the land itself. And that approach reflects understanding, not just of materials, but of terrain, of how to use what is already there to create something more effective than a structure that stands apart from it. And that understanding is what remains, not just in the walls, not just in the ditches, but in the overall design, the way everything works together, the way the site functions as a whole, and maybe that is what makes Maiden Castle stand out. Not because it is the largest, not because it is the most complex, but because it shows how people adapted their environment, shaping it to meet their needs in a way that combines natural form with human design. And that combination is what stays. The tombs, built for more than one, giants' tombs of Sardinia. At first they appear low and elongated, almost blending into the ground, not rising high like towers or monuments, but stretching outward, forming shapes that feel grounded, stable, and connected to the earth in a way that makes them less immediately noticeable from a distance. But as you move closer, the structure becomes clearer. Because what seems simple begins to reveal design. A long central corridor, stone slabs forming the sides, a curved front that opens outward, and at the center of that front, a taller standing stone, often placed in a position that draws attention, creating a focal point that defines the entire structure. These are the giants' tombs of Sardinia. And despite the name, they were not built for giants, but for people, communities that lived thousands of years ago, and created burial structures that differ from individual graves in a significant way. Because these are not single burials, they are collective. Spaces designed to hold multiple individuals over time, suggesting that burial was not only about the individual, but about the group, about shared identity, about connection that continues beyond death. And that shift matters, because it changes how the structure is understood. Instead of marking one life, it represents many. Instead of isolating, it gathers, and that gathering is reflected in the design. The corridor is long, narrow, enclosed, creating a space that extends inward, a place where bodies were placed one after another over time, building a continuity within the structure itself. And that continuity suggests memory, because returning to the same place for burial implies recognition, a connection between those who were buried before and those who come after. And that connection is not accidental, it is maintained, repeated, preserved through action. The curved front, sometimes referred to as an exedra, also plays a role in defining the space, because it opens outward, creating an area in front of the tomb that may have been used for gathering, for rituals, for activities connected to the burial process. And that openness contrasts with the enclosed corridor, creating two spaces, one external, one internal, one visible, one hidden. And that division reflects structure, not just physical, but conceptual, because it separates what is seen from what is contained, what is accessible from what is reserved. The stones themselves are large, not as massive as some other megalithic structures, but still significant enough to require effort to move in place, especially without modern tools. And that effort reflects organization, because constructing something like this requires coordination, the ability to bring materials together, to shape them, to position them correctly, ensuring that the structure remains stable over time. And that stability is evident, because many of these tombs have survived for thousands of years, even as the surrounding landscape has changed, even as parts of the structures have been damaged or eroded. And that survival shows that the design was effective, not only in function, but in durability. But the purpose of the tombs is not limited to physical burial, because the repeated use of these structures suggests that they held meaning beyond the act of placing bodies within them. They were places, recognized, returned to, maintained over time, and that continuity suggests that they were part of a broader system of belief, a way of understanding death not as an isolated event, but as part of an ongoing connection between individuals and their community. And that idea changes how the structure is seen, because it becomes more than a tomb. It becomes a point of connection between past and present, between those who were buried and those who continued to live. And that connection is expressed through repetition, through returning, through the use of the same space again and again. But even with this understanding, there are details that remain uncertain. The exact rituals performed, the specific meanings attached to different elements of the structure, the reasons behind variations in design across different sites. All of these are not fully preserved in a way that allows complete reconstruction. And that leaves space for interpretation, for multiple possibilities, for meanings that may have changed over time. But the physical structure remains clear. The corridor, the curved front, the central stone. All of these elements are consistent enough to show that this was not random. It was designed, planned, executed with intention. And that intention reflects understanding, not only of construction, but of space, of how to create a place that functions both physically and symbolically. And that dual function is what defines these tombs, because they serve a practical purpose, and at the same time, they carry meaning. Meaning that is not fully visible, but is expressed through the structure itself, through how it is built, through how it is used, through how it is maintained. Even now, standing in front of one of these tombs, the shape is still clear, the alignment still visible, the sense of direction still present, guiding the eye from the open front into the enclosed interior, creating a visual path that reflects the physical one. And that clarity allows us to understand the design, even if we do not fully understand the meaning behind it. Because the structure communicates something. Not in words, but in form, in arrangement, in the relationship between its parts. And that communication is what remains, even after thousands of years, even after changes to the landscape. Because the core design is still there, still visible, still showing how it was intended to function. And that persistence is what makes these tombs significant, not because they are large, not because they are complex, but because they represent a way of thinking about death, about community, about continuity, expressed through stone in a way that still exists today. And that expression is what stays. The earth city that rose without stone, Cahokia in mounds. At first, it doesn't look like a city. There are no towering walls, no carved stone blocks, no obvious ruins in the way we expect from ancient places. Just large rises in the ground, smooth slopes that look almost natural, as if they formed over time rather than being constructed. But that impression is misleading, because these are not natural hills. They are mounds, built, layer by layer, basket by basket, formed from earth that was carried, placed, shaped, and raised over time until it created something far larger than what the surface alone suggests. This is Cahokia, and at its peak, it was one of the largest urban centers in North America, a place where thousands of people lived, worked, and organized their lives around a landscape that they themselves had constructed. And that construction is what defines the site. Because unlike stone-based civilizations that leave behind walls and monuments, Cahokia was built from earth, a material that is both accessible and temporary, requiring maintenance, reshaping, and continuous effort to preserve its form. And that choice of material reflects adaptation, using what is available, working with the environment, but also understanding how to transform it into something structured. Because building a mound is not just about piling dirt. It requires layering, compaction, planning, ensuring that the structure remains stable over time, that it does not collapse or erode too quickly, that it maintains its shape despite exposure to weather and use. And that level of construction shows knowledge, not written, but practiced, developed through repetition, through observation of how materials behave, through refinement of methods over time. The largest of these structures, often referred to as Monk's Mound, dominates the site. Rising above the surrounding area, it creates a focal point, a central feature that defines the layout of entire settlement, not just in size but in presence. Because elevation changes perspective, it creates visibility, it establishes hierarchy. And that hierarchy is not only physical, it is social. Because structures like this are rarely built without purpose. They often serve as central points for activity, for leadership, for organization, places that hold significance beyond their physical form. And that significance may have included ceremonial functions, administrative roles, or both, creating a space that connects different aspects of the community. But the site is not just one mound, it is many, spread across the landscape, arranged in patterns that suggest planning rather than randomness, forming a layout that includes open plazas, defined spaces, and pathways that connect different areas. And that organization reflects structure, because it shows that this was not a collection of isolated constructions. It was a system, a coordinated environment where space was used intentionally, where areas were designated for specific purposes, where movement was guided by layout. And that level of planning suggests a complex society, one that could organize labor, manage resources, and coordinate activity across a large population. Because building something like Cahokia requires more than effort. It requires cooperation, the ability to bring people together for a shared goal, to maintain that effort over time, to ensure that construction continues, that structures are maintained, that the site remains functional, and that cooperation reflects social structure, leadership, roles, systems that support collective action. The materials themselves also tell a story, because different types of soil were used in different layers, sometimes selected for specific properties such as stability or drainage, showing that the builders understood how to use variation to improve the durability of the structure. And that understanding is not accidental. It comes from experience, from learning what works, from observing results, and applying that knowledge in future construction. But even with all this evidence, there are still questions. Because while we can see how the mounds were built, the exact details of their use, the full range of activities that took place on and around them, are not completely preserved. There are interpretations, based on patterns, based on artifacts, based on comparisons with other sites, but no single explanation that covers every aspect. And that leaves space for uncertainty, for interpretation, for ongoing study. But the physical presence remains clear. The mounds, the layout, the scale, all of it shows that this was not a small or simple settlement. It was organized, structured, intentional, and that intention is what stands out, because it shows that people were shaping their environment in ways that go beyond immediate necessity, creating spaces that reflect social organization, belief, and identity. Even now, walking across the site, the scale is still noticeable. The rise of the mounds, the openness of the plazas, the alignment of different features, all of which create a sense of space that is different from the surrounding landscape. And that difference is part of the design, because it defines the site as something distinct, something constructed, something that carries meaning, not just in its form, but in its arrangement, in how it is experienced, in how it organizes space. And maybe that is what makes Cahokia stand out. Not because of stone, not because of height alone, but because it shows that even with earth as the primary material, it is possible to create something that is structured, lasting, and meaningful, something that reflects a level of complexity that is not immediately visible, but becomes clear the more it is understood. And that realization is what stays. The stone chamber built to hold time, Tinkin's wood burial chamber. At first it seems almost too simple to hold significance. Just a large flat stone resting on smaller upright supports, forming a structure that appears minimal in design, with no decoration, no intricate carvings, nothing that immediately suggests complexity. But the scale changes everything, because the capstone is enormous. Weighing many tons, it stretches across the chamber below, creating a roof that feels disproportionate to the supports beneath it, as if the balance itself is part of what defines the structure. And that balance raises a question, because placing a stone of that size into position is not a small task. It requires planning, coordination, and an understanding of how to move and lift something that cannot be handled by a single individual, especially without modern tools. This is Tinkinswood Burial Chamber, a Neolithic structure located in Wales built thousands of years ago, and it represents one of the most well-preserved examples of a chambered tomb, a type of construction designed to create an enclosed space beneath stone, a place where the dead were placed, not individually but collectively. And that collective aspect is important, because the chamber was not meant for a single burial. It was used over time, multiple individuals, placed within the same space, and that repetition creates continuity, a connection between those who were buried before and those who came after. And that connection reflects a different way of understanding death, not as an isolated event, but as part of an ongoing process, a shared space that extends across generations. The chamber itself is enclosed, formed by upright stones that create a defined interior, a space that is separate from the outside world, not just physically, but conceptually. Because entering such a space, even now, changes the environment. The light shifts, the sound becomes contained, the sense of openness is replaced by enclosure. And that change is part of the design, because it creates a distinction between outside and inside, between what is visible and what is hidden. And that distinction may have carried meaning, because spaces like this are often associated with transition, with movement between different states, between life and death, between presence and absence. But the structure is not only about the chamber, because the mound that once covered it would have extended outward, forming a larger shape that is no longer fully intact, but still suggested by the remaining structure. And that mound would have created a more substantial presence, raising the structure above the surrounding ground, making it more visible, more defined within the landscape. And that visibility matters, because it turns the tomb into a marker, a place that can be recognized, returned to, maintained over time. And that repeated return suggests that the site held significance beyond the initial burial, because it became part of the landscape, part of the memory of the community, a fixed point that connects different moments in time. The construction itself also reflects knowledge, because arranging stones in this way requires understanding of weight and support, the ability to position the capstone so that it rests securely on the uprights, distributing its weight evenly, ensuring that the structure remains stable over long periods, and that stability is evident, because despite its age, the chamber still stands. The stones remain in place. The structure holds. And that durability shows that the design was effective, not only in function, but in longevity. But even with all this, there are aspects that remain uncertain. The exact rituals performed within the chamber, the specific beliefs associated with the burial, the meanings attached to different elements of the structure, all of these are not fully preserved in a way that allows complete reconstruction, and that leaves space for interpretation, for multiple possibilities, for understanding that is based on evidence but not fully defined by it. But the physical presence remains clear. The capstone, the chamber, the alignment, all of it shows intention, planning, execution, because this is not a natural formation, it is constructed, deliberately, with purpose. And that purpose, even if not fully understood, is reflected in the structure itself, because it shows that people invested effort into creating a space for the dead, a space that is not temporary but lasting, a place that remains even as generations pass. And that permanence is important, because it suggests that memory was meant to endure, that the connection between the living and the dead was not meant to disappear, but to be maintained through a physical structure that continues to exist. Even now, standing beside the chamber, the scale is still impressive. The weight of the stone still apparent, the balance still visible, creating a sense of something that was carefully arranged, not just placed. And that arrangement reflects intention, because every element contributes to the whole. The supports, the capstone, the enclosed space, all working together to create something that functions both physically and symbolically. And maybe that is what makes Tinkinswood stand out. Not because it is the largest, not because it is the most complex, but because it shows how a simple form, when executed with precision and purpose, can create something that lasts, something that carries meaning, something that connects time in a way that is still visible today. And that connection is what remains.